In this video, we will discuss the racism within undergraduate and graduate studies, focusing on the fault line of the city of Los Angeles, Cal State Northridge, and the Cal State University system. At CSU Northridge, racism in higher education persists through the removal of developmental general education courses on ethnic studies. The Black Student Union at CSU Northridge is one of our first stakeholders when understanding the 2017 campus movement against Executive Orders 1100R and 1110, where their experiences are written about in ethnic studies as praxis. In California, Chancellor of the CSU system Timothy White proposed the removal of general education requirement classes in ethnic studies, queer studies, and gender and women's studies. This proposed removal would affect the whole CSU system. CSU Northridge, which is a minority-serving institute, would be disproportionately affected by this proposed removal, leading to the students protesting and striking on campus. Executive Order 1100R and 1110 would affect students of color disproportionately to white students. The removal of these courses affected students of color by taking away vital general education courses in math and writing, making it harder for them to succeed in later college courses. Students of color wouldn't have had access to similar college preparatory courses in high school compared to white students who would have alternatively grown up in more affluent areas, leading to more money going to their schools, and thus having better resources in place for them to get ahead in college. The disproportionate effect that Executive Order 1100R and 1110 have on students of color, highlighted in ethnic studies as praxis, is a perfect example of how racism is alive and within undergraduate studies in the city of Los Angeles. My second claim, which is understood through racialized experiences in-betweenness in academia, discusses the idiosyncrasies of racism, specifically through the model minority myth and the need for racism to be spoken out against. Organizations such as the BSU at CSU Northridge have spoken out against racism after the proposal of Executive Orders 1100R and 1110. Racism in higher education can materialize in many different ways and can affect different populations of students in different ways. Subtle racism can be seen at CSU Northridge by the removal of Gen Ed ethnic studies classes. While on the surface, the removal of these classes looks as if it is a positive for students by making it look like it would reduce graduation requirements. Instead, its effects would harm students of color and make their undergrad experiences much more challenging. My third claim utilizes the resource "The Business School is Racist" ACT UP. At CSUN, the proposed removal of EO 1100R and 1110 devalues knowledge and supports racism on a structural level. The Business School is Racist ACT UP has some helpful insights into this. The Business School is Racist ACT UP is a culmination of multiple aspects of my first two sources. It contains the subtle racism that is talked about in racialized experiences in-betweenness, and also covers the overt and open racism which is highlighted in ethnic studies as praxis. In undergraduate and graduate studies, racism takes many forms. It's already been established by previous sources. This source attacks racism from a different direction. It uncovers the subtle and overt racism that is perpetuated by the faculty in the business school, from the professors to the curriculum that they teach. It boils racism down to a way of teaching and shows us how racism is deeply ingrained within the pedagogy of the business school.
A lot of scholars have argued that the face of racism has changed, that it's not overt racism, it's not PC to be overtly bigoted anymore, but we see it more in subtle ways. In a physical interaction, you might see someone take a step back from a black man, for example. Like in an elevator, you might see a little bit more distance.
The Business School is Racist unpacks the curriculum that is taught and how its origins come from racism from the slave trade to early economics. Similarly to ethnic studies as praxis, it is the calling out of the racism that is perpetuated by the business school and the CSU system, which is what will gain progress in creating a racism-free campus environment. My fourth resource, We Don't Need Another One in Our Group, by M.L. Way and Bonita Bunjan, explains the differences in racism experienced by international students and the incongruence between coursework and student participation. At CSUN, faculty express a concern for the relevance of ethnic studies courses to students of color's lived experiences. At CSU Northridge, there has been a history of student movements dating back to the 60s. Within these student movements, the Black Student Union at CSU Northridge has been very active in these movements. In 1969, the Black Student Union and the Students for a Democratic Society organized protests and sat in protest of allegedly poor treatment of minority groups on campus, according to the Sundial, which is basically CSU Northridge's form of news. The BSU CSU then in 1992 organized a rally against racism from the athletic director, who told the athletic department to stop recruiting black athletes for their sports teams. Activism on the CSU Northridge campus was not unheard of before the 2017-18 school year. It lines up with a long history of students of color standing up for their rights on campus and combating racism. Racism and interventions to promote the mental health and well-being of racialized international students in business school, which is the longer name of the article by M.L. Way and Benita Bungen, brings up an interesting argument that racism experienced by international students has many mental health implications, from increased anxiety and depression rates, students feeling excluded and being less likely to engage with other students.
I would say if people believe that racism doesn't exist anymore, that the microaggressions that I study don't matter, then I would ask, why do I find associations with depression and self-esteem and sleep quality? If it doesn't matter, it shouldn't affect adults. So if we're finding these relationships, then it really supports the argument that race isn't out of the picture. It's still an important issue. It's just changed into a way that might be harder to perceive.
Ethnic studies as praxis doesn't state any direct correlation between racism experienced by students at CSU Northridge and the student movements that were sparked, but through the extensive research and evidence provided in Racism and Interventions, it is safe to say that students who experience racism at CSU Northridge definitely experience some of the mental health impacts that come from it, whether it is racism experience.
Good at math and science. When you complain, people want to say, how thin-skinned could you be? Why are you politically correct? They're trying to pay you a compliment. Yet it's false flattery. It allows the whitewashing of the very real problems. It allows people to say, what are you complaining about? You're doing better here than you would in your homeland. Of course, not realizing that America is our homeland.
Whether it is racism experienced from other students or faculty or through the executive orders, which were the executive orders that were used to remove ethnic studies classes and general education classes, the impacts of racism are still felt by the students. Timothy White, the chancellor of the CSU system's proposal of Executive Orders 1100R and 1110 are examples of subtle racism within CSU Northridge and Los Angeles. And just to clarify, Executive Orders 1100R and 1110 are proposed removal of ethnic studies courses and general education requirements. While the impacts of the proposed executive orders were largely felt by students of color at CSU Northridge and other CSU campuses in California, these executive orders weren't largely acknowledged and didn't make it into the widespread media. Coverage of protests were mostly done by the Sundial. Without doing research on the full effects of Executive Orders 1100R and 1110, it would be hard for people to know that they promoted subtle racism on campus. From the outside, the executive orders look as if they are helping students to reach higher levels of achievement on campus through the removal of general education classes, but in reality, they'd be decreasing the amount of classes that students of color would have to help them succeed in a system that already has many barriers in the way of their success. Los Angeles has been a city with a rich history in social uprisings against racism, specifically the LA riots in 1992 after the police beating of Rodney King and the protests after the death of George Floyd at the hands of police. Within CSU Northridge in Los Angeles, there have been many student-led protests against racism on campus. At CSU Northridge, faculty of color experience the outcomes of the subtle and overt forms of racism. With the proposal of Executive Orders 1100R and 1110, faculty members would also feel the outcomes of the removal of these general education classes. In academic institutes, faculty also experience the same subtle racism that students experience. Faculty of color are mis- and underrepresented in academia.
Questions. Our stance at the USC Race and Equity Center is that you absolutely cannot lead on racial equity if you don't know how to talk about race. And the overwhelming majority of higher education leaders, not just presidents, but also other senior leaders, don't know how to talk about race. They're scared to death of approaching it, largely out of inexperience.
Martha Escobar, a Chicana/Chicano studies professor at CSU Northridge, who is also the founder of Project Rebound and one of the authors of Ethnic Studies as Praxis, experiences racism from a faculty perspective at CSU Northridge. Martha D. Escobar, the founder of Project Rebound and one of the authors of Ethnic Studies as Praxis, is one of the main advocates for students of color at CSU Northridge. Project Rebound helps students who have previously been incarcerated to succeed in the CSU system. As an ethnic studies teacher, Martha D. Escobar Escobar's classes would be put in jeopardy of being removed, leaving her out of classes to teach to students who need them the most. As an educator at a minority-serving institution and the founder of a program helping formerly incarcerated students to succeed, Martha Escobar understands the first-hand impacts that the removal of these classes will have on students' academic journeys. Martha Escobar understands from the student's perspective the racism that is at play here in the CSU system. Racism in undergraduate and graduate studies is a complex and expansive topic. It's not possible to cover all of the areas and institutes that it affects within one 10-minute video, but we can do our best to understand its effects within the city of Los Angeles. For Project 2, my video discussed the racism within undergraduate and graduate studies, focusing on the fault line of the city of Los Angeles and CSU Northridge and the CSU system in California. With Los Angeles being an incredibly diverse city with many different racial and ethnic groups living there, in my video I tried to focus on the main aspects of racism within the academic world. While doing this, I found it hard to not think about the factors that produce this racism in the academic world. While doing my project, topics such as redlining came up when thinking about schooling and the schools that students would be zoned for. I found that to understand racism in the academic world, you have to look back and understand the factors that lead to racism from elementary schools to high schools and then on to higher education.